Ready. All right, I got to ask, is my mic okay? Because last time we had all kinds of mic issues, and it was totally on me, by the way. So, my own error. All right, as you guys know, we've been memorizing the Sermon on the Mount as a church. I did not ask them to put it on the screen today, so if you want to stand up as we recite it, and don't worry, we have a lot of guests, so if you don't know it, just grab the Bible in front of you, open to Matthew chapter 5. So please stand up, and let's all say Matthew 5, 1 through 12 together. And I've got mine up here for reference just in case I mess up. Oh, they did put it on the screen. There we go. All right, here we go. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Amen. Please be seated. I'll get to 13 through 16, but I think we were supposed to stop at 12 today according to our bookmark. Is that right? So I didn't want to pressure anybody who hadn't gone ahead. You know, you overachievers got to give the rest of us a break. You know what I'm saying? Well, 2 weeks ago and 3 weeks ago, Pastor Todd preached through these, and if you haven't seen those two sermons, they are marvelous, so go check those out online. But I just wanted to recap what he said. So, blessed here means happy. It's not a lot of the time the Bible brings up the word happy, but it actually does. It means happy. It means there's a certain kind of happiness that God's giving to these people. So let's walk through these Beatitudes one at a time. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And if you remember, it means a great humility. It means you have such a humility that you realize you have nothing to offer God. Nothing at all. You know that old story they probably told you when they shared the gospel with you as a kid? They're like, you know, when you stand in front of God in heaven, what are you going to say? How are you going to get in? And you don't have anything. That's what you're going to realize when you get there. You're going to be like, oh, I don't have the ticket. I don't have currency, right? Like, because that's what I hope you know now that you're poor in spirit. You can't get in there on your own. You can't be with the Lord on your own. You have nothing. It says that our righteousness is but filthy rags. But once you realize that, then yours is the kingdom of heaven. You see, Jesus is taking what a lot of people think about God, and he's flipping it on its head. That's what he liked to do, right? He liked to make everything topsy-turvy. And so once you realize that, you've now entered into a special citizenship, one that is above all earthly means, right? I hope you love America. It's a nice place to live. Well, these people, they loved Israel, their home country, and they were very proud of it. But he's saying that really the important thing is that you're members, citizens of the kingdom of heaven. And once you're there, things are different. It's a different kind of world. It's a different set of rules. We don't look like and play like the rest of the world. You ever walked into a different country and you immediately realize, like, I ain't from here, you know? I'm not one of these people. If you didn't know, I've lived in Asia a number of years, and when I lived in Japan, I felt that kind of every day. You know, I'd walk in to the convenience store and people are just kind of staring at you. Some of them maybe never seen a white person before, like seriously, and you're like, you know, I'm not one of you people, you know, and I never will be. But the difference is here in the kingdom of heaven, It has nothing to do with ethnicity. Moving on, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Todd did a wonderful job summing this up, but basically, when you mourn over your sin, God is going to comfort you. Because not everything you mourn over is worth comfort, is it? It's not. But God always comforts those who mourn over their sin, who realize that what they've done is wrong and offensive to him. But to get there, you have to be poor in spirit. You've got to realize you have nothing to offer him, because you don't. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Todd said this great little thing to rhyme, meekness is not weakness. It's a certain kind of gentleness. It's not trying to take everything by brute force, but realizing that God is the one in control and giving God control. Now, if you know anything about me, if you ever played a board game against me, I will just try to destroy you by all means. That's who I am. I want to win and I want you to lose. And here's the worst part. If you betray me or you come after me, I will give up trying to win and go after you and make sure you lose. That'll become my number one goal. And I want to do it by force, right? I'm going to put everything in me to make sure you lose. It's an awful character trait of mine, but I do it. Right? We can't just try to take control and do things our way. We got to surrender our circumstances and our thoughts and our actions to God, and we're playing by a new set of rules. I found this week, a guy named Joseph Benson. He was a Methodist in the early 1800s. And if you've never read your early Methodists, your John Wesleys, your George Whitefields, you're missing out. It's incredible stuff. And I translated it to modern English, so I hope I'm doing it justice. But he said, whatever happiness can be enjoyed on earth is their inheritance. They might not have honor or wealth, and they can't expect to be without troubles in this fallen world, thanks to the misery of the sins of man. But the problems of life and the pains and trials are going to be hardly felt, because you can receive them with a quiet spirit, a resigned, patient, and contented mind. That those people who are meek, who are going to inherit the earth, they get to genuinely enjoy the sweetness and comfort of all that God provides. And I thought that was the most marvelous understanding of inherit the earth I have ever heard. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. One thing you'll notice about millennials is we're annoying, right? We were born with a mic in our hand because we had the internet when we were little, and so we love to share our stupid thoughts. But one thing I do love about my fellow millennials is that they do love justice. They don't like hanging out with wrongdoers or people that they perceive to be wrong. That is where a lot of my friends, Christian or lost, that's where their heart hangs out, and that's a desire of God. We see it here. God doesn't like evil. He wants evil to be defeated. He wants evil to be rectified. He wants it to be made right. And if you hunger and thirst for righteousness, for goodness even, God is going to fill you. Blessed are those who are pure in heart, for they will see God. I don't know that I can explain it any better than those exact words. How do you get a pure heart? Only God can make you a pure heart. And once you have a pure heart, you start to see God and you start to see him in things I don't think you would have seen him in otherwise. Right? It's this transformative, complete changing. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. So we get grace and mercy confused. I know I did when I was younger. But grace is a free gift that you don't deserve. It's like a Christmas present. We celebrated Christmas with my family the other day, believe it or not, because my younger brother's in town. And so we got our Christmas presents in October, and it was kind of awesome. But I didn't deserve those gifts. That's grace. Mercy is withholding a punishment. So you've done something wrong, and a punishment should be coming your way, but you don't get it. That's mercy. And so if you are the type who are merciful, you will also be shown mercy by God. There's a wonderful parable about that you should look into. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. I think this has two meanings. I think people who try to achieve peace here on the earth with their fellow brothers and sisters, that we try to live at peace with each other's. That should be our default mode. That's who we are. That's what we should be. But also, when we have followed all of these steps and climbed this beatitude ladder, we realize we are also at peace with God. And Paul talks about this ministry of reconciliation in 1 Corinthians, right? That part of being a Christian is helping people learn how to be made right with God, how to have peace with God. Because if you don't know him, and you aren't following him, and you're not a believer, you don't have peace with God. You don't. It's a tough world to live in. And the reward is you'll be called a child of God. Man, that's what I hope people call me. There's no better title than be called a child of God. And then, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So you see, Jesus has wrapped it back up, right? The first blessing was the kingdom of heaven, and now the last is the kingdom of heaven. And if you're persecuted because of righteousness, right? Jesus is just saying, doing good things, doing the right thing. Yours is the kingdom of heaven. And then he adds to that. He said, blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, and because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. God's people have a habit of being hated. We sure do. And I don't mean the people who deserve it either. You know what I'm talking about? You know those Christians who are jerks and they're like, man, I'm being persecuted. It's like, nah, you're a jerk, man. I don't even like to be around you. You know those people. That's not who he's talking about. He's not talking about jerks. He's talking about people who are literally putting their life on the line, people who are taking risks, and they're doing it in a way that's just backwards to this world. That when they look at us, they shouldn't be able to resist. They should be able to say something about y'all. I don't know what it is. So we'll get into today's passage now. He says, you are the salt of the earth. But the salt, if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand. And it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Man, what is life without salt? I'm from the South, and I think if Jesus had preached this to a Southern crowd, he would have called us salt and butter, to get that image into our head, because there's butter in everything in the South, okay? It's how we survive. As a kid, I would literally take it out of the fridge and eat it, and that's, I don't know, I feel like that's more normal there. When I talk to people here, they're like, I didn't do that as a kid, that's gross. And I'm like, all right, sorry for weirding you out with my southernness. There was this wonderful TikTok video that explains how I feel at barbecues when I'm like trying to keep my mouth shut. This lady sees this guy barbecuing all this chicken, and it has no seasoning on it, and she just looks dead inside. She's looking at it like, oh no. And she walks over to the guy. She's like, hey, you going to put seasoning on that? And he's like, oh, we're going to do it later. And she's like, oh, yeah, do it later. And the first comment said, those birds died for nothing. What is life without some seasoning, That's our perception of salt. But what was theirs, right? What was theirs? When we hear salt of the earth, we think common, regular people. That's what I think of the people of Kansas, okay? I don't think that about my home state at all. They're the butter of the earth. They make things taste better. Y'all are the salt of the earth. That is something I've loved about being here. Y'all work hard. Y'all are kind. Y'all are not in your face about everything. That's, I think, the image we have. You just have this hard-working farmer, and I've met a lot here. That is correct, actually. I've heard this passage preached upon, and they'll go on and on about how salt was super valuable back then. And my small group challenged me, so I accepted the challenge, to check all the sources of pastors who preach, and I told them to do that to me. So I was listening to this guy, and I heard him say that, and I was like, I'm going to check. How much was salt worth back then? Because actually, throughout American history, it's been worth quite a lot. It was not worth anything. Jewish people, right, they're conquered, and so the Romans had control over the salt in all of their empire. They even had this thing called the Salt Road. And yeah, that's where the salt traveled. In 204 BC, I found the price. This guy said a pound of salt was roughly 1 sextans. okay? You don't know how much this is worth. We'll get there. And then in the mid-100s BC, so about 100 years later, a guy named Polybius, this historian, he says a foot soldier, that's the lowest person in the Roman army, was paid about 2 obols a day. Again, doesn't mean anything to you, does it? But I tried to calculate, okay, what's the sexton to an obol? I had no clue, but it turns out that if you were the lowest rank, you're getting paid 2 obols a day. A pound of salt was roughly 1/20th of your daily wages. You could afford some salt, people. It wasn't worth that much. Kind of like today, right? You go in, you see that Morton salt, it's worth like 70 cents. What is less than $1 today? Nothing. Salt is, apparently. It really was a common thing. It was also a preservative. Before refrigeration, salt was how we kept meat from going bad. It was the primary way. Back when humans were just hunting and gathering, right before we understood how to keep things from dying and keep it on our shelf for months, like blessed Spam, my favorite thing in the whole world. Right? They had to do this every day. They had to go out and hunt every day, and we've slowly made our lives easier and easier, and I'd like to know who figured out salt. Well, I found in 200 BC, this guy named Cato the Elder, he writes this huge book called De Agricultura. I don't know Latin, so I'm sorry. But it's basically about farming is the title of the book. And he had this whole section about how to preserve meat. Because, right, it's super important. If you've raised an animal and you've put everything you had into it, when you slaughtered that thing, you don't want to waste a single part. And so one of the primary ingredients to keep that thing alive was literally putting in salt for 2 days, flipping it over, and then putting in salt for 2 more days. It was essential. No one knows this better than me because I lived without a refrigerator for years. I know, crazy, right? So when I was in college, I was what they call living below the poverty line, very common for college students. And I lived in this building that was over 100 years old, and at one point, I think my rent was like $70 a month, right? If you're paying $70 a month, even now or then, you're probably not living in the greatest place. But all the refrigerators were in the basement, and everybody in the whole building had to share those refrigerators. And so if I ever got leftovers from church, that was how I survived. Really was. I had less than $1 in my bank account like all the time. My parents would call me, are you okay? And I'm like, I've got this figured out because church people are giving me free food again. Every Wednesday night, I would go and I'd work with the youth group, and they ordered Domino's pizza, right? And I would take it home, and I'd take home like 2 or 3 of these things, huge pizzas. And I would go down to our group fridge, and it was just stocked of other people's stuff. There was no way I'm putting 1, much less 3 pizzas in there. So I'd try to give some away. Nobody wanted cold pizza. It was already really cold by the time I got there. But I realized it's got so much salt in it, I could probably eat this for 2 or 3 days, and that is exactly what I would do. No refrigeration. No microwave, no nothing. That pizza stayed good. I know it's not the most savory thing to hear, but the salt in it worked. It really did. And here in Kansas, salt is used as a preservative still. You guys know the salt mines in Hutchinson, right? It's actually got this huge vault that a lot of movie studios use from California. They send all their stuff down. They have the negatives for Gone with the Wind, Ben-Hur, Star Wars, and Wizard of Oz down there. I mean, that's precious Americana right there. I don't want to lose any of those negatives. And if you were born before we had old school, or after we had old school photography, negatives were what they gave you whenever you, what's the word? You got film produced, you got your film looked at, developed. I couldn't remember the word. Whenever you got your film developed, right, and it was actually the opposite colors of what you had, and if you kept those negatives safe, you could go get your pictures back if you ever lost them. So this is essential, and because there's so much salt down there, it actually keeps it all safe, and the stuff doesn't age. It's kind of incredible. So what is Jesus saying about us then? You might think when you read this like, man, it's God who's the salt. That's not what Jesus says here. I think we'd all agree God is a great preservative of people. He's saying you are. You people are the salt of the earth. You're the ones who I have sent into a dying world to save it. This is how he chose to do it, was through all of us. And I know you're probably wondering, well, how do I do that? How do I look or act or be like salt? Well, Jesus made it very clear in all those Beatitudes, all those blesseds, that when we live a life, just living a life in that way, people are going to taste and see that we are weird. that we're different. I remember living in Japan. There was this young lady. I'm just going to call her Sarah. That was not her name. It was a Japanese name. But she became friends with one of my coworkers and eventually became friends with our whole missionary team. And she was just a wonderful lady, probably in her late 30s at the time. And we just hung out together, honestly. She came to church with us sometimes if she thought it was interesting. We were doing something cool at a Christmas party, but she hung out with us 24/7. And of course, we shared the gospel with her. We talked about God. We did all that stuff. But I got to be honest, the majority of our time was just being together, eating together. You can't talk about God 1,000 times and fast forward someone's processing process, right? We couldn't do that. And so eventually, she came and visited America with one of our coworkers who was on furlough, meaning she was back in America for a little while. So she came, visited her in the beautiful state of Oklahoma. And believe it or not, out there where they lived, there was a Japanese church. So my coworker's like, yeah, let's go to the Japanese church. They took her there, and she sat with the pastor afterward, and they're just talking about all of her doubts and all of her thoughts. And what came out was, I don't know what it is about these Christian people, but they love me more than my family does. I don't know what it is about them, but there's just something about them, and she couldn't get over it. And time again, we would hear that from different Japanese people, not necessarily about our missionary group, right? We're not perfect, but about Japanese Christians. You have to remember in Japan, that's less than 1% of the population. That's not a lot of people. Most of them had probably never met a Christian. And if they did, it was like that one kid in school who was weird because they didn't go to the temple or to the shrine, and they did things a little differently. We really, really stuck out there, and Japanese people even more so. R.C. Sproul, famous pastor, told this marvelous story. He said his roommate in college was a missionary in Sudan and Ethiopia among different tribes growing up, and a lot of the time when they showed up, it was the first white guy they'd ever met. And one day, he pulls out this photograph, hands it to R.C. Sproul, and he's like, look at this picture. There's like 25 to 30 natives in the picture, and he says, there are 12 natives in this picture who are Christian. Do you think you can spot them? And R.C. Sproul said it was the easiest thing he ever did. It took 30 seconds. He was like, this one, this one, this one, this one, and he got 12 out of 12. He nailed it. Do you know what was different about those men? Do you think they were dressed differently? Yeah, that's actually right. They weren't dressed any differently. They didn't look any different, but he said he could just see it on their face. They radiated joy, like they had been set free from this lifestyle of what's called animism, right? Where there's gods and everything, or spirits, or demons, or angels, depending on where you're at, but that you just live in this darkness, and you live in this world where you're constantly trying to appease these gods that are after you. It was the same way in Japan. They have two main religions, Shinto and Buddhism, and they like to stick them in a big bowl and mix them and say, yes, I'm both. And so in Shinto, they say there's, I think it's 7 million gods. It's another way of saying there's just so many we can't count them. And I would go to the shrines with them and visit and try to learn and understand. And at each shrine, it would have the name of the god, what they were famous for, and there was this whole process of just trying to talk to them, right? You had to clap your hands and toss a coin and bow twice and say a prayer, and when you said the prayer, you had to say your name, your address, and what you wanted, or what you didn't want, right? If this was a mean God, you're like, please don't come to my house. I gave you some money. Right? They're constantly just trying to keep that stuff away, and that mentality wears you out after a while. It weighs you down. And when you're finally free of that, I mean, it's going to flip things upside down. You're going to be totally different. I'm going to copy something my brother John Johansu said in Sunday school this morning because we were talking about this passage, and I absolutely loved it. He brought up James 5, where James writes, my brothers and sisters, if one of you should wander from the truth and someone should bring that person back, remember this, whoever turns a sinner from the error of their ways will save them from death and cover over a multitude of sins, right? It's not just the world we're preserving, but we're also in the world, right? So we preserve each other. And to be the salt of the world, we have to be in the world. God did not call anybody to run away and isolate themselves and go live in a compound. I don't believe that. Maybe for a weekend, but not for a lifetime. I think sometimes in our Christian walk, there are those of us who love to keep trying to escape the world, which you're never going to do. You're never going to fully escape or get out of here. You're here. Live in it. Be a part of it. Be a part of your community, your schools. And this isn't a dig on how people are different in our Christian liberty, right? We approach things differently, and that's okay. But just remember that full isolation is never the answer. You might have that image about monks, right? There's a long history of Christian monks who would go and supposedly isolate themselves and live alone and pray a bunch of times a day. Almost none of them did that. None. Most of them lived and worked in their communities and were constantly trying to reach people, and you can find different monks from 300 AD all the way to like the 1500s who were not living alone. The hermits were really, really rare. Even they understood it. So next, Jesus asks a tough question. He said, if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. Now, I hope you all have salt at your house, right? It's very white. Yeah. And it's actually very pure, or maybe it has iodine in it, which is good for you, by the way. There's a great podcast on that. But they dump sulfuric acid on the natural sources of salt, and it melts away all the other stuff. And so when you get natural salt, it's never purely white. Actually, I ordered some salt from the Dead Sea, and it's kind of gray. It's got little black specks in it. It's far from purely white. I don't know if you can tell under the light, but if you want to come look at it after, you can tell, right? It's just not very pure looking. Not in our minds. And that's because when we get natural sources of salt, it is bound with the minerals in the places it's at. That's why, Himalayan salt is like pink. And believe it or not, as I was diving into sources, I found one guy from like 200 AD who talked about salt for 10 pages and all the different colors and varieties and the things it came from. He even said purple salt. Have y'all ever seen that? I want to find it. I can't find purple salt, but he talked about it, and I was like, man, lost to history, I guess. But, right, it had all this different look to it. And when it binds with those minerals, it's different. And if you leave it out, that sodium chloride, that natural salt, actually leaches out. And what you're left with is a worthless rock of minerals. It really can't preserve anything. It can't. And so what Jesus is saying, man, if that salt's lost its saltiness, what can you do with it? Because our pure salt, you really can't lose its saltiness. It's been purified in such a way that I bet you could open your container of Morton salt, leave it open for weeks, and most of it would be fine, right? And you'd be like, it's salt, it's fine, right? Not how the natural salt works. And so when he says it's to be thrown out and trampled underfoot, I think there's two meanings here. And I think the first and primary meaning is that when we start looking too much like the rest of the world, we don't preserve anything. We don't save anyone. We don't do anything. And you're not good for anything. I really wondered this, and I'm not sure that Jesus means this, but I think it's an important thought. There is another dangerous use of salt. It's used in war. There's a lot of famous stories about salting the earth, right? Throwing it on the ground so that it would ruin the crops and no one could go back and grow there. Actually, it's used in the book of Judges. One of the judges, Abimelech, he destroys the city called Shechem, and he destroys the whole thing, and it says they salt the ground afterward. They're like, not only do we not want you to live here, we never want you to come back. And I think for Christians, when we hurt people, it's very powerful, it's very real. And if we're not salty, if we're not those beatitudes that Jesus mentioned, we can really hurt people. You ever had church hurt? I'm a fourth generation pastor's kid, okay? We all got church hurt in my family. So, as a matter of fact, when I was maybe 23, I remember my dad just staring at me and being like, how are you still a Christian? I'm like, huh? Where's this coming from? We're literally at a theme park. He's like, how are you still a Christian? I'm like, dude, I don't know, Dad. God is good, I guess. He said, you just seen the worst of all these people, and I wonder it all the time. After all the church hurt we've been through and all the things people have done to our family, I don't know what in the world, what kept you? And he does know the answer, okay? He knows that I saw the real Jesus, that I was lucky enough to see past that. But there are those who haven't, who have been really hurt. You ever hear those stories of big churches falling? They're always super sad. And the hurt people have, it's super real. I went to a counselor after some church hurt, and I was talking to him. And he gave me this really great piece of advice. He's like, dude, you're not going to like listening to pastors anymore. I was like, what? He said, yeah, they all say the same stuff. They all sound the same. You all like to read the same people, right? It's just who you are. You say the similar stuff. And so when you hear pastors say stuff that the person who hurt you has said to you, you're not going to know it, but your limbic system, that's the part that just reacts at stuff, is going to go in defense mode, and you're going to feel all kinds of crazy stuff. And I'll admit, when we first got here, there was a couple of sermons I didn't hear at all, because somebody up here said something, and I immediately tuned out and was just furious. And then I remember what my counselor said, and I was like, okay, so I'm not mad for no reason, right? It hurt. And so if you ever run into someone with church hurt, be careful about being like, well, not my church. Just say, I'm sorry that happened to you. Because what the hurt they feel it's real. It's real. I think the Pharisees were kind of doing a similar thing. Jesus said in Luke 11, now then, you Pharisees, you clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness, you foolish people. Did not the one who made the outside make the inside also? But now, as for what is inside you, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you give God a tenth of your mint, your rue, and all kinds of other garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. You should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you love most important seats in synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplaces. Woe to you, because you are like unmarked graves, which people walk over without knowing it. I think that's like my favorite diss Jesus ever gave anybody. When I read that, I'm like, whoa, slow down. In a Jewish context, touching an unmarked grave was going to make you unclean, right? If you touched a grave for any reason or a dead body, there was a whole cleanliness process, and so you were now ritually unclean. And Jesus saying, you are taking people over graves and they don't know it. You're making them unclean. You're causing damage to them. What a diss. Ugh. I think this is why our character matters so much. I think this is why the things that the church does and the way we love people, it really, really matters. That's the sad part. Back to the good part. Jesus, he calls us a light, doesn't he? You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it out on its stand. And it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that you may see your good deeds. They may see your good deeds, and glorify your Father in heaven. So I actually went out and bought a replica lamp of what they would have had. I was just curious, right? And this is a very cheap replica. If you want the real thing, it's like $300. So if you want a real lamp Jesus may have breathed on, $300. This was like 10, 15. And so if I can light it, I practiced this, y'all, and I'm afraid I might not get it. But you fill it with olive oil, and it's probably going to drip out, so that is okay. And it's a nice little baby lamp. Oh, man, I'm not going to get it. That's okay. Hey! Right? Right, they would take one of these and they would fill it with olive oil and a wick, and then it would just slowly burn. And as for a lampstand, you might imagine either a bigger one of these or like a menorah, right, which you probably seen in a Hanukkah celebration. It would have been something like that. And you put it up high so it lights the whole house. I couldn't find what that would have looked like. I was really curious. But the meaning is extremely clear. We have to let our light shine. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. I love that. I don't think we can hide light. I think it likes to pierce through. I think it finds its way out. You can't hide it. You can't. When you are following Christ, when he has changed your life, it radiates in such a way that it is unhideable. There's no way. And he says, neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on the stand and gives light to everyone in the house. You can try to hide it. You all know the kid song, right? This little light of mine, there's a whole part about hiding under a bushel. No. Does a kid know what a bushel is? I did. And I was like, this is a fun song. But I didn't understand it. I don't think there's any good in hiding our good deeds. That when you do something good, just do it. You don't have to worry about how it's going to look or trying to be anonymous. I think those are great things. And if you want to do it that way, you can. But man, when people look and see our good works, it's unavoidable. I'll never forget, there's a lady in my life. Her name was Deborah Smith. She must have been in her 50s and 60s when I really knew her. Deborah went to a small church outside of Birmingham, her and her husband Boyce. And they had a youth group, actually about our size, and they realized there was nothing for them, so they started this youth camp. And somehow the church never really grew, but this youth camp grew to 200, and I was one of the many kids who ended up there. And I got to tell you, every time you talked to Deborah, she was not a person, neither was Boyce, who liked to be on stage, who wanted to be up front, but they were constantly loving people. In the summer of 2012, I was looking for a job, and Deborah found me one. She found me one, sent me the application, said, you can probably get this, and then said, if you get it, just come live with us down here in Birmingham, because I'd moved to Texas. And I was like, sure, why not? Sure enough, I get the job, and I come to live with her, and right when I get there, they're like, oh, yeah, we met this guy at Winter Jam, the Christian concert series. He's about your age, and he just needs a place to stay, so he's going to be staying with us. His name's Lewis. And I was like, oh, okay. And as I got to know Boyce and Deborah, I realized like a million other people had just lived with them. They lived in this house, and they were constantly letting people in, and then every time I came home from work, there was more people at the house. I was like, how many people do y'all invite over? Right? You're always having people, and you're always hanging out, and they're just always loving on people, constantly. There was this story where a young woman in Virginia called him in the middle of the night, threatening to kill themselves. And if anyone ever does that, please call the police. And if you've thought about that, please get help. There's help for you, and you don't need to have those thoughts. It's a normal thing that I've dealt with for years at one point. And Deborah contacted people out there, reached out to the police station, and was like, I'm on my way. Do you realize, from where she lived in Virginia was 12 hours? Deborah was like, we're going to come get you. I'm on my way. Just stay there. And it ended up the woman was fine, and Deborah didn't have to go and get him, but that was who she was. And she passed away of cancer in 2019. And me and my younger brother, we went to the funeral, and it was packed. There were so many people. I've never seen a funeral like this. It was packed, and I'm just like, who are you people? Some of them I knew, some of them I didn't. And it was all people with stories like mine who they had just loved where they were at, and they had shined a light. And I look over in the corner, and there's my buddy Lewis, right, who had come to live with us. I mean, they were just always loving people. You couldn't stop them, and everybody knew it. The room was filled with people who were Christians, who weren't yet Christians, who used to be Christians, right? People who'd even left the faith, couldn't get over the love that Deborah and Boyce had showed them. Couldn't get over it. I heard this wonderful story from a Calvary Chapel pastor. It's a kind of a denomination. I don't know if they call themselves that, but they basically are. And he lives in Israel. And one day this rabbi comes to him, and he's like, dude, I want to hate you. I want to hate you, but I can't. You have all these schools, you feed the poor, and you're always helping the people out here. But I want to hate you. And he couldn't. He saw the light of Christ in this guy, and he didn't know it, but he couldn't shake it. He's like, there's something about this guy. I don't know what it is, and it made him angry. Lastly, Jesus said in John, the passage that Todd read today, that he was the light of the world, and he is. And I think when he says you are the light of the world, he's passing that title on to you. Right? It's a title that Jesus is giving to you, that you can shine your light, and it's something he'll help you do, that he'll be a part of. I've heard this explanation, it says in Genesis that we're made in God's image and that we are reflectors of God's greatness when we are working as we should, when we're being as God designed us. I think that's what Jesus means, though. If we reflect characteristics of God, if we live by those Beatitudes, people won't be able to stay away. There was a guy in this podcast my wife was listening to. His name was David McRaney, and he wrote this book called How Minds Change, and he said something I couldn't get over. He's like, most people who change their mind, they don't jump to the ideas first. They actually change groups first, that the people will somehow invite them in and bring them over is what I think he meant. That's how we should be. Right? You should share the gospel. You should tell people about Jesus. Don't miss that, okay? Paul said it a bunch of times. I'm not saying don't do that. But we got to love people right where they are. And you'll see very slowly, I think, as God changes and he works and he transforms somebody from darkness into light. Let's pray. Father God, I just want to thank you first for your amazing word. God, that you would teach us to be more like you, that you would show us how to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. God, that we don't have to necessarily hide our good deeds. That we are to be representatives here on the earth, and that's how you wanted it. That most people here will be the only Jesus anyone meets and the only Bible anyone will ever read. That we are your representatives, and I just pray that we do that well. And if we've sinned, God forgive us. I know I have. I know I've been a horrible representative of you many times. Please forgive me. And help me to love people better. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen.